Good afternoon and welcome to Heritage Foundation's webinar, The Food Supply During the Pandemic, Facts from the Front Lines. My name is Darren Bax and I'm a Senior Research Fellow in the Heritage Foundation's Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies. I want to thank all of you for participating today. There's so much going on and so much on all of our minds. So just thank you for taking the time to participate today. So one of the biggest concerns that all of us have is about food. And we go to the stores, we see empty shelves, and that understandably concerns us. We wonder if we have enough food. Are there food shortages going on? And if not, are there going to be food shortages in the future? And even if we have food, is the food in fact safe? And then in the media, we hear tons of different stories. So what is actually happening with the food supply chain? So today we're going to hear from some experts that will help answer these questions and a lot more. But before I introduce them, I want to stress this program is not just about presentations, it's also about your questions. We want to provide you answers as best we can. So if you look in the bottom of your the right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see something that says questions. So please use that to type in your questions and feel free to ask questions throughout the program. After the presentations, we'll have a Q&A period. And we'll monitor that and we'll try to answer the questions to the best of our abilities. There are some other little buttons in the bottom right as well, like a raised hand. Don't hit that because we're not monitoring that particular feature. So again, just hit the questions. So now I'm honored to introduce our presenters in the order they will present. Tom Idrecki is Vice President of Supply Chain and Logistics at the Consumer Brands Association. Tom represents the collective transportation, technology, sourcing, and sustainability priorities of America's consumer packaged goods industry. And from there, we're going to go to Doug Baker. Doug is a food retail industry relations vice president for FMI, the Food Industry Association. Doug facilitates professional, non-competitive collaboration among member communities across private brands, technology, and supply chain resilience issue areas. Now, there is a third presenter that was supposed to present, and he still might. He's in Alabama, which got ravaged by weather last night and tornadoes, and we're hoping he can make it, and that'd be great if he could. So don't be surprised if he pops in, and I'll introduce him if he does make it. So at this point, I want to turn it over to Tom.
Thanks so much, Darren, and really a pleasure to be part of this this presentation today and to provide a little insight about what's happening on the front lines of America's food supply chains. And I think as everyone is well aware and well versed, I don't think we've ever seen the word supply chain be in the media as much as it has been during the coronavirus epidemic. It's not as if America's supply chains are normally the sexiest topic of conversation, to be very frank. It's not something that comes up very often, whether that's from a policy perspective in Washington or even just from a daily accountability standpoint, right? That there's sort of this assumption that when you go to the grocery store, there's product on the shelf. That's the assumption of living in America, and that's something that's like sort of a foundational element, I think, of like why people are just like, oh, like of course we have that, or you don't anticipate there ever being a toilet paper shortage, and yet somehow right now there is, and the question becomes why. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think the first thing that needs to be said and that needs to be emphasized across the board, and I'm sure that Doug and others would back me up on this, is that America's food supply chain is strong and resilient. It is not something where you know, as if you're just gonna America's gonna run out of food and people are gonna starve and the whole thing is gonna go to hell. That's not the case. But what is the case is that the coronavirus, I think, has raised and surfaced certain vulnerabilities within the supply chain, and that could be within private industry's control, whether in terms of like how you went to a sort of specific efficiency drive over the course of time, right? Like this hyper optimization and how do you need to recalibrate or rethink your operations in light of a pandemic? And it also presents some policy questions or ponderings that I think deserve to be thought about going forward to increase resilience in America's supply chains. One of the ways that the Consumer Brands Association, just given the nature of the companies that we represent and that are really consumer first interest, has gone about looking at supply chains was to conduct a weekly survey of everyday American consumers and to say what was their experience. I think that one of the things that I think I always try to sort of lead with when I talk about supply chains is that you'll hear this messaging that's out there, right? That America's food supply chain is resilient, it's strong, and yet as a consumer, you go to the store and you don't see products on the shelf. And those things seem to not be compatible, right? There's this incongruity to, well, this is the experience that I have, and yet I'm being told that it's the exact opposite. And you'll then hear further messaging sometimes, right? If you look at like the NBOC dashboard or other things like that in Washington, and it'll say that it's due to, quote, artificial demand, that the sort of the out of stocks are not, and at the same time, right, like as a consumer myself, my experience of an empty shelf is not artificial. There's a real problem or challenge there. And so what we were trying to do in some of this consumer research is peel back the layers of the onion, if you will, and say, what are consumers experiencing? What are the demands that they're putting on the system, or how are they preparing for coronavirus? And can we better understand then some of the potential policy solutions or ideas that we would want to recommend to government going forward because of that? And so in that research, one of the things I think that is very obvious, right, is mounting concern over coronavirus and its impact on supply chains. And so week over week, you see more participants in the survey express that they are preparing in some capacity. That sort of, I think, reached a level capacity, right? That like most Americans at this point are aware that coronavirus is a thing, that they're concerned about it, and that they're therefore preparing. When it comes to then their experience at a store level of this, what we've seen week over week is that for the most part, there's also increasing concern, especially around certain types of high demand products. Those could be household and cleaning supplies. You'll see on this chart here where there's this mounting concern about access to those items. I am sort of enthused by the fact that we saw sort of a peak spike in the food and beverage product space, and that's since leveled off, I think, a little bit. I think that's because of sort of an initial panic buying that was out there in the market, and that is sort of since returned to a level of normalcy. I do think that one of the things that we've also seen from our manufacturers, and when we've talked to our manufacturers, is that there is now, in lieu of that panic buying, you saw this initial spike. I think it was somewhere upwards of 120 to 130% increased demand initially in that panic buying phase, and that's since leveled off to what most people ascribe to around 30% increased sustained demand just in comparison to normal times. And that's the equivalent of basically of an Easter holiday all year long. And why is that? It's because people are at home, they're sheltering in place, they're feeding their family. And if you go to the next slide, you can sort of, I think, start to see what people are looking at and trying to plan ahead for. So in the talking to most consumers are at this point actually very well stocked on essential products, or at least I think in their mind. One of the open questions that I have going forward is the extent to which we see this preparation then translate into whether that'll be continued demand in the future, whether people will sort of realize that they overbought, if they've underbought, how well that advanced planning matches the actuality of their consumption habits. I know that in my household, for example, I think that we all went out, we bought products, and then we're shocked to discover that actually when you stay at home, you eat a lot more, you snack a lot more. There's other products though that you don't consume a lot more. And so one of the interesting things to watch, I think, in the food supply chain is the extent to which certain products continue to experience increased demand. That could be household basics, it could be milk, eggs, cheese, sort of the types of things that a family might regularly eat, except for the fact that they might eat that regularly, let's say on a weekend. But now that consumption habit is different because the types of products that they normally consume during the week, maybe it's like an on-the-go protein shake or something like that. Actually, they're not consuming a lot of those. And so you saw maybe an initial spike in demand for that product, but in the beverage space, you saw a decreased decline overall. on the flip side, I think one of the funny things is that you also see this increased sustained demand for alcoholic beverages during coronavirus too. So even within product sectors, if you will, there's different demand consumption habits that consumers are experiencing, and I think it'll take some time for the industry to fully assess and respond both at the manufacturing level and at the grocery store retail level to what are those new consumption habits and demands that are present on the system. But I think that everybody is now well aware of the fact that there is this increased sustained 30% on average demand and are preparing adequately for that. In talking to a lot of our manufacturing executives, they're all extremely confident that they can meet that sustained demand. I think that there's a number of issues on their mind that are prescient given some of the ongoing circumstances around PPE availability and other factors there that are influencing how they think about their strategy going forward. And that's something that I think deserves to be mentioned as part of this conversation as to what is the resiliency of America's food supply chains. There's a number of questions that I think that are drawn out of the coronavirus pandemic, how it's influencing our attitudes to how you design supply chains, how do you manage them, and then what are the things that are necessary that we may have even taken for granted ourselves to how that system has to work and what's necessary in order to facilitate that end-to-end movement of goods and services from the agricultural side to our manufacturing facilities on trucks to retail stores to the end consumer. And there's a whole host of products and services that are necessary, not just the physical ingredients themselves or the input products, but this could be gloves or hairnets or soap dispensers themselves. There's actually a run currently, not just on the soap and on the hand sanitizer, but on the physical pumps that you would see in sort of an industrial warehouse. And so there's this strain that's been put on the system just in aggregate, I think is presenting some unique challenges to how do you, as an industry, represent those needs? And then how do you assign or ascribe, where does the food industry's, I would say, need fall relative to the medical supply chain, which of course comes first. And given the demand that is being put on that system for personal protective equipment and some of the sanitation and cleaning supplies, of course that gap has to be filled first. But then when it comes to shoring up America's food supply chain, I think that really needs to be a crucial second bucket, right? Where you have to have, if you're going to have people shelter in place, they have to then have continued access to the everyday goods and products that are essential to their well-being and health, so that they don't need to go to the store as much, or they don't need to worry about their own sort of personal circumstance, but that they can safely quarantine themselves or sort of stay out of harm's way. So there's I think a number of policy issues, like I said, that are raised or presented by this. It's something that the Consumer Brands Association, in partnership with our companies and other associations, has increasingly raised to not only members of Congress, but the administration and others, just to really get a coordinated approach to how do you improve the resiliency and competitiveness of America's food supply chain. How do you, like I said, tackle all of those interrelated pieces along the way? And that's why I think that we've been so successful in partnering with other organizations, whether it's the American Trucking Association or our colleagues at FMI or others, to say, you know what, they're across the whole range of that supply chain. There's a host of stakeholders that need to be shorn up and to be supported in this time of crisis, so that that consumers ultimately and everyday citizens can have the products and services that they need.
Thank you so much, Tom. And I'm really happy to be able to say that Brent, has actually made it. As I said, he's been ravaged by some storms down there in Alabama. So, Brent, thank you so much for making it. Let me just briefly introduce you, Brent. Brent is the Chief Relationship Officer at truckstop.com, which helps truck drivers and freight brokers manage their freight from end to end. Brent is a transportation and logistics professional, and has been that professional in that field for over 20 years and has tons of leadership experience in those fields. So, Brent, take it away.
Well, thanks, Darren. I appreciate Tom's comments as well, and thanks, our thanks from truckstop.com to you and everyone at the Heritage Foundation for having us on today. You guys do a lot in the leadership of the country, and it's appreciated. Trucking in general is involved in everything that goes on. For those of us that don't know the company that I work for, truckstop.com is a marketplace. We're a marketplace that helps freight, America's freight, move across the systems that it's built on. Inside of our marketplace, we handle around 100 million loads a year, and we connect 65,000 trucking companies with third-party logistics players that move the freight. So I say this because I think it's important that you kind of understand who truckstop.com is, because most people have never heard of us if you've not been in trucking. And it's hard to say it's hard to say what's going on in America without talking about the freight, the goods and services that take care of America. And we at Truckstop get a really unique point of view into the marketplace. Around 20% of all the freight that's moved in America is seen in our network each year. So the first slide that you're looking at on the screen is very unique to the market. And what it does is it shows a 3-month look back at what freight has done inside of trucking. And it's important to look at freight because you can understand how easy or how hard it is to get things in the market. And we all have certainly experienced that over the last few weeks with challenges in just getting what we need from our grocery stores to help run our lives in this pandemic. The slide, if you look to the left, you see that a normal market for America is around 300,000 to 500,000 loads a day. And you see that in January, it was about that. And it was that, and it started building up right before the COVID-19 pandemic broke out. And I use this slide because I think it's important to look at what's a challenge for goods to get around America. So we as a citizenry can run our lives. As you look to the right on that slide, you'll notice that it goes from about 500,000 to 700,000. The reason that's significant is that when it moves above normal levels, it's hard for the trucks that are available inside the marketplace. And to give you an idea, there's about 3.5 million commercial trucks inside the marketplace. And as it moves up past a normal market, it becomes very, very difficult for goods to move. And so they get hard to go to the store. One of the things that, as you look at this, you'll see that as it goes over to the right, it comes down very fast. And so that creates a problem inside the market when it comes down fast. Any shocks in an economic curve make it challenging for the people that work inside of that economy. And those are the truckers and the brokerage companies that work inside of this market. As you see, the curve has come way down, which means there's less goods that are needed to move. And the reason that's a challenge is that we work in a dynamic marketplace when freight is moved. It goes up and down, and as there's less freight in the marketplace, it makes it harder for America's trucking companies, the ones that move the freight, to succeed and survive as they're needed as things come up. So that's an important part to look at the market when you look at that, because you can look at the ebbs and flows of how the economy is doing. When there's more freight in the market, the economy is usually growing. When there's less freight in the market, economy is usually struggling, and certainly through COVID-19, we're going to have some challenges. If you'll go to the next slide. One of the questions that was asked is how are shippers and brokers and carriers, and those are the 3 type of companies that work to move freight, how do they fit into the food supply chain and why they're important? Well, it's no greater time than today to realize how important it is for the things that we normally, especially in this Amazon type economy where we're used to getting things the next day or even the same day, to see how much of a challenge it can be when they're not there. So how do they fit in? Well, they are part of the food supply chain, and without them, the food doesn't get back and forth. The reason that I say this is that out of the 500,000 companies that just serve freight, there's about 900,000 total transportation companies, and about 500,000 move the refrigerated goods and the van goods that get to us. About 80% of all of the freight in America goes on a truck. So at one time or another, it's going to hit a truck. And it doesn't matter whether it comes from a container, whether it's offshore or whether it's in a different part of the country, it's going to hit a truck at one time or the other. And that's why the U.S. trucking transportation network is so important to the actual food getting back. To give you an idea, we saw during a 5-week period of the spike on that previous chart that I showed you on the spike, we saw a 141% increase in refrigerated goods being moved. We saw a 50% increase in van foods, and that was all food and food-related household products being moved. So you can see where that creates a heck of a challenge inside of a marketplace to get it there. How else they fit in is that our entire segment of the marketplace, by the way, 1 in every 6 jobs, 1 in every 11 jobs is a trucking related job. The trucking related jobs were deemed essential by the FMCSA in order to get the goods in. That shows you how connected they are to the overall food supply. But to give you an idea of the surge and how those things happen is that those 100% increase in some areas and 40% increase in other create a heck of a demand in the marketplace to get those things in. And the big issue for the food being moved is how it was packaged. A lot of it that we have seen where you've seen a giant challenge in the employment inside of the food related industries is how it was packaged. And I didn't look at that. I was talking to our chief economist, and he said it's not that we didn't have enough food, that's how it's packaged. So you got to change it from industrial packaging into retail packaging so it can be sold at the stores. And that's a big shift, and making that shift is not easy for our economies to do. Go to the next slide. So what kind of challenges are truck drivers facing? To kind of give you an idea, there's 3.5 million commercial truck drivers in the overall heavy duty freight transportation. So the big rig trucks you see going down the road, there's about 3.5 million of those men and women out there serving America. And to kind of give you an idea, for the first couple of weeks of this, there were all kinds of challenges where areas were closed, they couldn't get food, they couldn't stop to rest. There are all kinds of challenges because of the concerns on the pandemic. Today, the biggest concern is what you hear in the news, which is the PPE stuff, although it's a little more basic for a trucker inside of food transportation, it's that they don't have cleaning supplies to clean their truck. They have trouble getting to places and taking showers. You can't park a big rig in just any old place. And but fortunately, America's network of the thousands and thousands of truck stops and travel centers around America are doing a good job. It's really that the supplies are really not available for truckers to be able to clean what they need in order to be able to be taken at the docks. And that's another big one of the big problems where you've got employment issues with trucking companies. There are some areas in which they're not deemed essential. So there's docking challenges, and what I mean by docking, so a delivery place where they're bringing the goods into. So that's been a big challenge because either the times are limited or there's no staff to unload. So it's a big challenge. Now the network itself is adjusting and accommodating to it. So that's not as big an issue as it was the first 3 or 4 weeks when you saw the big surge of freight. And also food was an issue. If you'll go back one slide, food was an issue, but it's really being taken care of well by the travel centers that are out there. They've even authorized the government even authorized where food trucks could deliver food to truckers at truck stops. So that's the place that they can go to. They can park their vehicle where they can actually get food. So that's a wonderful thing that's going on. On to the next slide. One of the things that was asked of me was how's the overall health concerns of the truck drivers that are out there and the people that work in the offices, the overall concerns. And then what are the concerns to the food supply? We do a lot of research inside at truckstop.com, and one of our partners is Bloomberg. And Bloomberg does a quarterly study, and the latest quarterly report, which just came out 3 days ago, was a really unique question. Some of the sentiment for moving freight is getting tighter and tighter. In other words, it's harder and harder for them to be able to run their businesses because of the challenges in the marketplace. But the big thing was what you see on the slide here, which is 63% of drivers in the marketplace are concerned for their overall exposure to COVID-19. Now that's a big deal. These guys they can't not be out there for our health, for our sustainability of America. So they can't not be out there. And this is how they make their living. Without it, they go out of business. But the unique thing is the second part of the slide, which is even though 63% are concerned, 74% say that's not keeping them from doing their jobs. which is remarkable. I think it's remarkable in how the American spirit of the U.S. transportation network is there. I mean, they're there to help. They don't consider themselves heroes. They say, man, those are the people in the hospitals that are helping the ones that are affected, that are medically affected. We're just out there trying to do what we do best, which is to help America succeed. The last question I'll cover is what could financially create a big problem inside the marketplace? If you'll go to the next slide, and I'll end here. One of the biggest challenges is cash flow inside of transportation. They run on extremely thin margins. It's somewhat of a commoditized industry, so they run on very, very thin margins. In other words, they don't make a 30% return on their business every day. It's usually less than 10%, in a lot of areas less than 5%. So the big challenge is cash flow and finances. And I bring up the CARES Act because it was nice that happened for the American public and American businesses. It's a wonderful thing that we as a citizenry can do things like that, and our government can administer it. But the challenge is this. The challenge is this, is that trucking is dominated by small businesses and micro small businesses. Absolutely dominated. 90% of the companies are small business and micro business. Micro business is like 1 or 2 people running a business. And the challenge is not that the money's not that they don't know the money's not there. It's just that it's hard for them to get their hands onto it, because the banking setup is you have to work with one of your known banks or a bank that has access to the CARES Act payroll protection money. But the issue is that they're typically not writing loans that are that small. Banks have a challenge with that because it's such a small return to them, and then they're overwhelmed. They're to be administered through the bank, so that's going to create a big challenge for us. But I think there's some areas in which the people are going to be able to work through it to be able to get to it. It'll just take time. And does it? So the big thing is, can enough cash flow happen in enough time to where when the big surge comes back and we come out of this, and all those goods have to get back to the warehouses, back to the retailers, and back to full supply? Are there going to be enough trucks available to be able to do that? And so we at Truck Stop certainly are behind helping that happen in the marketplace. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brent. Now, Doug, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Darren, and appreciate the other 2 speakers. So by now, you've all seen just exactly, how what goes into getting food to a shelf. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about what's going on inside of the retail environment. For those of you who are not aware, FMI, the Food Industry Association, represents retailers from one-store operators to multi-state and multinational retailers, wholesalers and distributors that distribute to those retailers, as well as food manufacturers. And we support our members in 3 key areas: government affairs, food safety, and then key business topics and activities similar to supply chain resilience and emergency response. So on February 25th, FMI stood up its crisis response team to start preparing the industry for what we were learning from our members who had business in China. And we quickly understood that although we have a lot of things in place to deal with disaster, we deal with disasters on an annual basis. And retailers and this supply chain is no better than when the public needs us the most. So that we had that experience, but we also understood that we were going to be rewriting this playbook, and we have been rewriting this playbook almost on a daily basis. As Tom mentioned, over the weeks of March 8th through March 22nd, retailers and this entire grocery supply chain experienced unprecedented demand as consumers loaded their pantries, largely in part to concern that they would not be able to access those food and supplies that they need. And so this immediately became the storyline. Was, as a result, many wanted to know, will we have enough food? And the short answer, as you heard from Tom, is yes. This country has an abundance of food. We also export food, which many of those exports slowed down during this time frame. But will we have shortages? Absolutely, yes. You can only produce so much food in a day, and many of the manufacturers that both CBA and FMI represent were running 24/7 to maintain, to even try to keep up with the demand that we were currently experiencing. Also, one thing to think about too, as Tom alluded, a lot of people were eating at home. So we know that on what I call blue sky days, when we're not in the middle of a crisis, 54 cents of every dollar is being spent on food away from home. And so a large percentage of that came back to the grocery store and back in homes, which also puts a lot of strain on an already strained supply chain. And why we've continued to see those sales levels stay at a higher level, because we're not going out. And we do appreciate the restaurants that are still able to offer takeout or delivery. That is a great alternative to cooking at home, and it's a great way to support that industry. So we'd encourage everybody to do that. One of the things that we did to partner with the food service industry is we created a joint venture with the International Food Distributors Association. And understanding that their sales were starting to decline because they've either been asked to close or shut their in-store dining, they had a lot of inventory in their supply chain. And so through this partnership, we were able to make that inventory, make those trucks and drivers, the resources, labor resources, as well as capacity in their facilities, make that available to grocery retailers. And the way we did it very early on, it was a fillable form. And we're getting ready to do version 2, which will be much more high tech, but we needed to move quick, right? So we created a fillable form. Both sides, both parties were able to fill that form out. The food service side was able to tell people what they want, what they needed, or what they had, I'm sorry. And then the retail side was able to tell them what they needed. And again, product, people, and equipment, and capacity in warehouses. And so we had some really good early results, and we've been able to move through some inventory that it would have been sitting in the supply chain on the food service side. I was also asked to talk a little bit about e-commerce. So one thing that we saw in China, where one of our member companies has their global headquarters in Wuhan, China, to be exact, is at a certain point over there, they saw brick and mortar sales actually decline pretty significantly, and everything moved online. So we started having those conversations with our member companies to start talking about how can they increase their windows, because when you order, you have to order within a window. You can only do so many windows in a day because of the labor that it requires to support that pick movement. And if you weren't, how could we quickly get you up to speed in doing that? Is it even taking an order by phone? So we had retailers across the country that were really just moving as quickly as they could to start getting that up and running. As an example, typically, again, blue sky days, a retailer's percent of sales on average for the country online is between 2 and 3% of their total store sales. They're now seeing anywhere from 12 to 20 to 25% of their total store sales. And that's a very labor intensive activity, right? The consumer's not coming into the store and doing the picking for themselves. Now an employee has to do that. And so what we saw is, as stores were closing down certain full service areas of their store, could be the deli, the bakery, the hot bars, the salad bars, the seafood, then they were redeploying that labor. And we had great partnership with the local unions to be able to get them to be able to move that labor into other areas. And some of it was for this activity of online. Some of it was for just refilling the shelf, and others was for developing a sanitation team. One of the things that this industry was starting to really work in and pilot in was developing micro fulfillment centers. And those micro fulfillment centers take stress off of the retail store. Unfortunately, we were still very early on in that phase. So some retailers did have those micro fulfillment stores, but many of them were actually doing the pick inside the store. So if the store was feeling out of stocks and shortages, then both was online going to feel those same things. So we actually anticipate micro fulfillment centers to be increased, the development of those, whether they're in store or they're a standalone, or maybe they close a store that's slow and just turn it into a dark store. We think moving forward, micro fulfillment will become a very big play within this industry. Another big concern was around food safety concerns, such with produce and bulk foods. So the CDC there's no known transmissions through food based on the CDC yet. So you're perfectly fine going in and picking your own fruits and vegetables and putting them in a bag. similar to any other day of the year. And I'm the perfect example of one person that doesn't do it. I don't bring my produce home and wash it off, but we should be doing that under normal circumstances. And so that would just be the recommendation, is when you bring home your apples and oranges and lemons and otherwise, just give them a good wash before you use them. You're going to cook them, you're going to peel them, so there should be no issues there as well. What I talked about early on was the pandemic preparedness for the industry. That also included a number of business practices for in-store sanitation and person-to-person contact. And as we've moved through this, we've actually continued to update that document, which you can see on your screen. And that's become a document that's both utilized fully by the industry and or used as a benchmark. And much of it is either through business practices that we've learned through this, but it's also based in CDC and FDA science. So there's a lot of information in there and a lot of support for retailers to be able to take that information and use it. It's also really important with a food safety standpoint, safety in general and sanitation in general, in order to maintain your labor force. As you heard from Brent, people are concerned, and we know that this is person-to-person contact primarily. And so it's important for us to, and we immediately started putting into place social distancing measures inside the grocery store. So you see in the news cycle, many of them were putting up plexiglass. So as you came to the transaction area, there was a plexiglass divider between you and the cashier. We had a couple retailers that actually created social distancing monitor techs, and they'd have a shirt on, and they were the social monitors, and they would go around the store, and if they saw that customers were getting too close, then they would politely go up and ask them to separate. That was also the same for employees. So they were keeping an eye out on everybody within the store. But we also then started looking at other things. And again, learning from our member companies who had business in China and business in Italy, we were seeing some really quick early opportunities with putting space tape down and decals down on the floor in order to encourage that spacing within the store. And most recently, you also saw where retailers were increasing sick days, they were increasing and giving hazard pay. And then now, based on CDC recommendations now, face coverings are now an option for staff if you want to use and wear them in the store. But it's ultimately about understanding your surroundings, having the hand sanitizer, doing the self-sanitation, and making sure that you're keeping that distance between you and the consumer, both for your safety and the consumer safety. Another thing that we did to try and sort of shore up labor force and understanding, that we had a number of other industries that were being asked to close is weekend before last, we kicked off a talent exchange program, which was powered by Eightfold AI. And what that does is it allows the industries that were actually being asked to close, and instead of furloughing their employees, they can put them up on a platform. And when they go on that platform, it allows them and the potential hiring company to start having a conversation. And it identifies open positions, based on title and based on what the job tasks are. And it allows those folks that are in that portal to be able to see those, and then they can start that interaction. Like I said, we launched it last Friday, and on Monday, we already had 500,000 people in that portal. It started off as it's a business-to-business thing. So as an example, a company like Macy's, they could enter their entire associate pool into that platform, which then makes them available to have conversations with grocery retailers, product manufacturers, all the way through the supply chain. So that's something else that we've just launched, and it's been going extremely well. A couple glitches early on, and we worked through them. Again, we're sort of working at a pretty fast pace through this whole process. So I would just say for anybody listening, food supply is abundant. Will we see shortages? Absolutely, we will see shortages. What does sick associates mean in the manufacturing world? You've seen a lot in the press lately about meat production plants that are closing because they've had a number of associates that were confirmed with COVID-19. And that does impact the supply chain, but it's not critical. And what I would like to make sure we understand is that there's a critical disruption. So I don't know if you've heard the lightning going on over top of me. Brent, we're starting to feel some of the pain that you went through last night. But when we have a critical disruption on the supply chain, typically during a hurricane, it's when we have a power outage or we have flooding or we have wide debris fields, and it actually shuts off that supply chain and it's not able to get to its end point. We don't have that today. We do have instances where we have associates confirmed, and we might have a production facility that closes down for 3 days to a week. But there's well over 600 protein production facilities across the country, and each one of them does a various amount of food. Some are primary source, some are secondary sources. But what that will do is it will move. It will require some time in order for it to move, so you'll see those shortages. And then hopefully by the time it moves, then the facility that did close voluntarily to do that sanitation and allow their employees to get some rest and get healthy again will come right back on pretty quickly. So that's it for me, Darren. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. And now let's go quickly into questions. Again, if you have questions, if you look in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, just click on questions and type in your questions. And guys, we'll try to move through these relatively quickly. We do have a decent number of questions. I think the first question is actually a fairly tough question for you guys, so I'll ask it from one of our participants. What happens if truck drivers or port workers or grocery store workers refuse to work?
Yeah,
You want to start with Brent with the truck?
Yeah,
work our way up?
a good one for me. Then we're in a world of trouble. We depend on everything to get to a location. I mean, we're not all in one city, and there's 38 million of us, something like that, and we're spread out all over the place. If our supply chain of supplies is not, if we have a shortage or a challenge for them not being able to work, what if they refuse? What if they can't work? Then we've got a serious issue as a company, as a country, no doubt. I do not think that's not the nature of the marketplace. The nature of the marketplace is to be very patriotic, very supporting of America, very supporting of people. So in my 22 years in the different challenging economies, even the Great Recession that we went through, truckers still showed up for work because that's what they do. That's how they operate.
I think it was Brent that had made the comment that the truck driver, truckers don't see themselves as heroes in this circumstance. And I don't think that any of us represents an industry where the employees see themselves in that same capacity. But I do think that the issue of potential absenteeism or workplace safety sort of raises the stakes when it comes to how do you ensure that the employees have access to the supplies that they need. So Brent, myself, Doug all mentioned the sort of the PPE component, and to what extent you can ensure that there's that safety element across the supply chain, I think is really important to ensuring that continuity of service.
Yeah, and I would agree with both. One thing that we've seen come out of this is a lot of patriotism. My brother works in a grocery store. I grew up in a grocery store, and it's just what we do. You wake up in the morning and you go to work, and you might be going in a difficult situation, but you continue to do it. And you do it because you're taking care of a community. Those retail grocery stores become the center of the community. And during a difficult time like Brent just went through with the severe tornado down there in Alabama, a lot of times that grocery store becomes the community center where people get information, right? So that's a real dependency on the community, and you take that with you. My community became my family. I saw those people in the store every week and sometimes multiple times during the week. And so I felt like I was taking care of them. But it is extremely important for us to understand that we need to, as a country, make sure that those individuals have what they need to do their business. My wife is an ICU nurse, right? So when we talk about masks, I think about her, and I think about how important it is for her to have that mask, and how important it is for my brother to have that mask. And so, we need to make sure that we take care of those individuals so they can continue to take care of the country the way they have been. I applaud every one of them.
Thank you. So I'm going to try to consolidate a couple of questions that we have received. And it's related to Smithfield, and they closed a plant and they've had some cases of the coronavirus. And what do you think the impact of that is, or just kind of the impact on the coronavirus with animal protein in general?
Sure. You want to take it, Tom, or you want me to go?
Why don't you, just because you jumped in, why don't you take it, and then I can follow up with some commentary too.
Sure. Yeah, as I mentioned sort of in my dialogue, anytime you have an employee or a facility shut down, it creates a ripple effect on the supply chain. There are multiple producers across the country. So it really depends on how much output that producer was doing, and if that supply chain can move, it can move to another producer, and that they can then elevate theirs. What it does do is it sort of backs it all the way up, all the way to the farm. So that's the other thing that we also have to keep in mind, is that as you're bringing cattle or pork or whatever to the slaughterhouse to be processed, that whole process gets backed up. And so that's why you're seeing in the news, you're seeing some where eggs are being crushed or milk is being dumped. When you take the food service industry out of the equation that was doing 54 cents of every dollar, that's significant. Then if you add on top of it where you have to shut a facility down for a period of number of days, that continues to back that inventory up. The good thing is that there are multiple production facilities across the country. And if they can pick up where the other one left off, then we will see shortages, but it won't be critical disruptions.
And I think that what Doug said is exactly right. I think when you look at just that facility, I want to say it's like 3 or 4% of America's total pork production. But there is that resiliency built into the system just by virtue of the fact that you have a number of distribution channels, of producers, of just the scale of it. And not to make that like too big to fail analogy, because America's food system is not too big to fail. But there is a built-in resilience just by the inherent nature of it. But I do think, again, and not to like continue to belabor the same point over and over again, but it raises also some of the unique aspects, particularly of protein manufacturing or of distribution, because of just the proximity of workers generally speaking within those facilities, because of how it's much easier, let's say, to institute certain changed production practices within, let's say, a beverage manufacturing context than it is within a protein manufacturing context, just by the different nature of those businesses. And so I think it also speaks to the need for not just standards across industry, but also to recognize some of the unique constraints that those industries are under.
Great. And there's a related question, and we should move through these quickly because we have a lot of questions. You've seen some farmers that are dumping crops or dumping milk. What does that mean? What's going on?
On the dairy side, Darren, this time of year, cows are producing more milk than they produce throughout any other time of the year. This is what they call flushing season. And so there typically is dumping that's going on right now, even when we are not in a situation like this. But if you, with the understanding that we shut our schools down all the way through college and many food service, again, you now have a surplus of inventory. The Dairy Association worked with many of their producers. Wherever possible, they worked with them to start making those components of dairy, so butter and yogurt and ice cream, and increase those inventories. But it's almost impossible to be able to absorb the additional inventory that has now become available because of food service and schools closing down.
Okay. Brent,
Yes, sir.
question for you. Any kind of anything you're hearing directly from the truckers about concerns that they have, like regarding rest areas, things like that?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. There was a lot of concern with that, especially in some northeastern states in the beginning, because what happened is that they shut down all the rest areas, period. What they did is the states, the FMCSA got contacted back to the state DOTs and said, you gotta keep your rest areas open. Now, granted, it is still a state issue, but we don't hear of any one single state shutting down all their rest areas. There are a few that are shut down. They're shut down to the, well, there's a couple things. Number one, they're shut down to the public. So they shut down the actual building. So there's no staff there, but they're still allowing the truckers to park. And that's the big issue. It's a truck parking issue. So my understanding is Pennsylvania had a little bit of challenge in the beginning, but they opened most all of them back up, especially on the thoroughfares where the truckers need them the most. So we're not hearing that anymore, but certainly it was an issue in the beginning.
Thanks. This is kind of a policy question. A lot of states have been waiving regulatory and licensing requirements. Are there any types of restrictions that governors or state legislators can temporarily waive or change to support the food supply?
A number of states have already done this, and it's just by virtue of emergency declarations. But I think that the truck weight limit is something that continues to be of interest, at least to the industry, in terms of just facilitating the greater, more efficient movement of goods. I know that there's some, I think, existing concerns from an insurance standpoint and other aspects there within the trucking industry side that maybe have not allowed that type of additional movement to take place. But it's an area, I think, where there's a need for continued dialogue and exploration, really at a federal level too.
Yeah, to follow up on Tom's point, that's a state issue. You could have it approved in one state and not approved to the neighboring state, and the goods have to stop. You find that in the specialized hauling, the really oversized stuff. But yeah, so that's a longer solution to it, but certainly something to be looked at.
So what has been the impact on supply chains from Canada and Mexico? Have you seen anything at all?
Can take at least from a manufacturing side of things. I think what it raises the need for, and this is happening within the U.S. as well, when you look at different localized restrictions or orders or definitions of things. But anytime you have cross-border trade, there's sort of this inherent need for added uniformity across those lines. And when it comes to what has been defined as critical infrastructure or as essential industry, you see varying interpretations of that, just like you do in the US, right? And so the DHS and CISA can put out guidance on, well, this is what critical infrastructure is here, but that may be different within any of the Canadian provinces. It could be different in Mexico. I know that a number of our members, for example, have issues right now in Mexico due to plant closures or facility closures. Just as a sort of I want to say like a fun example, but like beer, for example, is an allowed critical infrastructure within the US context. It is not in Mexico. And so there's a number of breweries that have had to shut down, which I want to say, okay, yes, that it impacts beer production, but that also impacts clean water production. It impacts grain or sort of that part of the supply chain as well. And from a livestock feed perspective, in terms of what that product then eventually becomes. And so there's, I think, a need for that uniformity across both state and country lines, and that's something that we're have been in conversations with the State Department and other parts of the administration on.
Thank you. We'll kind of move to a lightning round here because we've got like 5 minutes left, and I've got a couple of questions for you, Doug. Let me ask the first one. We'll do that quickly, and then the second one. And what happened to real-time inventory control by supermarkets to avoid shortages in certain consumables?
Sure. Yeah. So just-in-time inventory, you know, a lot of the conversations was the number of years we were implementing just-in-time inventory. Did it put us in the situation we're in today? And I would say no. You know, in blue sky days, we still have another issue. As a country, we waste a lot. 27% of all the food that goes into a home is wasted. So we still need to work on that. And Tom will be able to speak to this probably a lot more eloquently than me, but there is safety stock within the industry. Many manufacturers maintain that safety stock anywhere from 2 weeks to 12 weeks to deal with situations like what we're dealing with on a smaller scale, right? If we have a natural disaster and we need to get goods to a certain part of the country, then we can do that. If even as simple as something as an ad that went much better than planned, that safety stock comes into play. We did have that safety stock for this. And we had that safety stock and we used it. We used it very quickly, which was a good thing because we had it to be able to use. But now what it means is that as those machines are producing that food, a lot of times that inventory is not even going to the forward warehouse. It's going directly to the retailer's distribution center or the wholesaler.
Thanks, Doug. I've got a question for you, Brent, from one of our participants.
All
Has
right.
there been any discussion about the military or National Guard stepping in to assist with transportation?
I've not heard it. We talked to the American Trucking Association and all the rest of the associations that lead our industry, and I've not heard much of that talk at all. There's been in the last 10 years, there's been a concerted effort to recruit ex-military transportation professionals over to heavy-duty trucking, but not anything from a standpoint of a government authorization for that.
Maybe the last question, maybe we'll get 2 more in, we'll see. It's actually kind of an agriculture question, so I'll pose it to any of you. Do you anticipate any problems with harvesting because of a lack of migrant workers?
Tom, you want to start?
Yeah, and I think it's an issue that the industry is watching closely, just because, of course, you have a growing season, you have a harvest season, and you have to have a harvest like at some point, and you have to have workforce to do that. And so it's an area I think that's being monitored and looked at really closely in terms of how do you ultimately facilitate that. And Doug, I can transition that over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were much more concerned about it a number of weeks ago simply because of visas, right? And so the government quickly responded to that. Secretary Perdue quickly responded to that. I think that the unknown now is if that workforce has actually gotten the disease in their country, the virus in their country, and they're not able to come. So we depend on that workforce. And I want to say the number was pretty large, like 250,000 that come across the border. Canada, I know what they're actually doing as migrant workers come into Canada, they're being asked to quarantine for 14 days before they actually go to work in the fields and doing their picking and harvesting. So it's definitely something we're watching very close. You probably saw on the news over the last couple of days, again, because of food service, we produce an abundance of vegetables. I think the one guy said, I guess not many people are making onion rings at home. They only like them when they come to the restaurant. And it showed, unfortunately, a number of onions that were being cultivated under, and they'll be replanted very quickly. So we have a very resilient supply chain, but getting through this season and have enough workers to be able to do the picking and the packing is going to be pretty important. And it'll probably have a bigger impact on us as we go further through the year, maybe in third or fourth quarter or first quarter of 2022.
So Doug, Tom, and Brent, I want to thank you for sharing your expertise today. And I want to thank all the participants for participating and also the incredible amount of excellent questions. I know I didn't get to some of them. Sorry about that. Before we close, I wanted to just make sure that we have the people who've been hit with the severe weather in the South in our prayers. It's extremely important. And also, as we close out, just remember to stay safe. And we certainly hope to see you soon, but preferably in person. So take care. And again, see you soon. Bye-bye.